My son whispered, "Dad says your voice isn't real." Then I heard the recording. The recording began with my son crying. Not loudly, not the way a 7-year-old cries after scraping his knee or losing a favorite toy. It was the small, uneven sound children make when they are trying to keep an adult from hearing them. Then my voice came through the courtroom speakers. "If you tell your teacher what happens in this house, Owen, I swear you're going to regret it." My husband sat 6 feet away in the charcoal suit I had bought him for our 10th anniversary. Daniel kept one hand flat on the table. The other rested beside an untouched yellow legal pad. He had not written a word since the hearing began. He did not need to. He had heard the recording before. The family court judge turned toward me. Behind Daniel's attorney, the custody evaluator lowered her eyes to the report in her lap. My attorney, Camille Brooks, remained still. Before we entered the courtroom, she had told me that Daniel's side would be watching every movement I made. If I crossed my arms, they might call it defensive. If I interrupted, they might call it unstable. If I cried, they might call it proof. So I kept both hands beneath the table and listened to a woman with my voice describe hiding pills in a bathroom cabinet. She used my rhythm. She flattened certain words exactly as I did when I was tired. She paused before saying Owen's name. She even carried the slight roughness I developed after speaking for too long in dry air. Then she said something I had never said in my life. "Sometimes I think Owen would be better off if I didn't come home." Daniel's attorney stopped the file. The judge adjusted her glasses. "Major Mercer? Is that your voice?" Daniel finally turned toward me. He did not smile. He was too careful for that, but his shoulders loosened slightly, as though he believed the hardest part of the morning had passed. "It sounds like me," I said. "That was not my question." "I understand, Your Honor." Camille touched one finger to the corner of her folder. "It was our signal to slow down." "The voice is mine," I said. "The words are not." Daniel shifted in his chair. His attorney stood. "Your Honor, Mr. Mercer received this as a voicemail from Major Mercer's number. He preserved it because he feared for his son's safety." "That description is disputed," Camille said. The judge raised one hand. "You will have your opportunity." "I understand. I only want the record to reflect that this file was not found in Mr. Mercer's voicemail history." A muscle moved near Daniel's jaw. The judge returned her attention to me. "Major Mercer, are you alleging that someone fabricated this recording?" "Yes." "What evidence do you have?" The speaker on the clerk's desk had gone silent, but one sound remained in my head. 4 church bells, a pause, then 2 more. They had been faint beneath Owen's crying, almost too faint to notice. Daniel's father had noticed them. Leonard Mercer sat in the back row with both hands folded over the polished handle of a wooden cane he rarely needed. While the recording played, his thumb had moved slowly across the wood. The moment the bells rang, it stopped. Camille rose. "We are prepared to show that this file was not recorded when Mr. Mercer claims and contains speech assembled from older recordings." Daniel leaned toward his attorney. The judge asked, "How long will you need?" "Less than an hour." Daniel's lawyer gave a dry laugh. "To explain church bells?" Camille turned toward him. "No. To explain why the same bells are hidden inside every recording your client submitted." That was the first time Daniel looked frightened. 3 months earlier, I had not known there were any recordings. I had simply come home from Germany, opened my front door, and watched my son step away from me, as if I were wearing someone else's face. Daniel and I had been married for 11 years. After a marriage ends badly, people often rewrite the beginning. Every kind moment becomes manipulation. Every disagreement becomes a warning. Every photograph becomes proof that the happiness was fake. I tried not to do that. There had been good years. When we met, Daniel was teaching media production at a public high school outside Hampton, Virginia. I was an Air Force captain working in communications systems. He liked old movies, made excellent pancakes, and remembered the birthdays of people I had met only once. When Owen was born, Daniel handled more school forms and pediatric appointments because his schedule was easier to predict. He attended preschool concerts. He packed lunches shaped like dinosaurs. He once drove 40 minutes back to daycare because Owen had forgotten a stuffed bear and refused to sleep without it. Those things happened. So did everything that came later. When Owen was 3, I spent 4 months overseas. Every Sunday, Daniel recorded a bedtime story so I could hear our son's voice. In return, I sent recordings of myself reading books from a dormitory room with beige walls and a refrigerator that hummed through the night. "Good night, Moon." The Gruffalo. A ridiculous story about a bear who joined the Air Force because Owen insisted bears could fly if they believed hard enough. Daniel saved every recording. At the time, I thought it was sweet. His father helped edit some of them. Leonard had spent nearly 30 years working in local radio. After retiring, he managed the audio equipment at St. Matthew's Church, recording sermons, concerts, and a weekly community podcast from a small room beside the bell tower. He hated background noise. If a truck passed while I was speaking, Leonard removed it. If Owen interrupted to ask for water, Leonard cut the interruption and joined the sentence back together, so neatly that I could not hear the break. I had thanked him for it. The same skill I once appreciated would later be used to make my son afraid of me. I was 41 when everything began. Daniel was 43. Owen had just started second grade. My assignment in Germany was supposed to last 6 weeks. It was not a combat deployment, but the days were long, the systems were restricted, and the 7-hour time difference made family calls awkward. The morning I left, Daniel stood beside my car with one hand resting on Owen's shoulder. "Don't worry about us," he said. "We know how to survive." Owen was wearing dinosaur pajamas beneath his coat. He made a plastic triceratops salute me. I laughed, kissed his forehead, and promised to bring back chocolate. Daniel pulled me into a hug. For a long time, I hated remembering how safe that hug had felt. Daniel had complained about my career before, though rarely in a direct way. He called the Air Force the third person in our marriage. He usually said it while unloading the dishwasher or folding Owen's clothes, with enough humor in his voice that I treated it as a joke. A few months before Germany, he had been offered a job directing media programs at a private school in North Carolina. It paid more than his teaching position and included a house on campus. He wanted to accept it. I did not want to move. A transfer for me was unlikely, and leaving active duty would have affected our benefits, retirement plan, and mortgage. I gave Daniel all the practical reasons. He said he understood. I believed we had postponed the decision. Daniel believed I had made it for him. What I did not know was that he had already told the school he planned to arrive before the fall semester. He had told Leonard that Owen would be moving with him. He had told everyone except me. During my first week in Germany, our video calls felt normal. Owen showed me a loose tooth. Daniel complained about the washing machine making a grinding sound. I promised to look at it when I came home. By the second week, Owen had become quieter. Whenever I asked him a question, his eyes shifted toward someone outside the frame. "What did you do at school today?" A quick glance to the side. "Nothing." "What did you have for dinner?" Another glance. "I forgot." Daniel said he was struggling with my absence. "You know how he gets," he told me. "He needs consistency." The sentence sounded rehearsed, but I was working 14-hour days and sleeping badly. I told myself Daniel was tired too. That was one of my mistakes. My assignment ended 4 days early. I did not tell him. I wanted to surprise them. I imagined Owen racing down the hallway. I imagined Daniel pretending to be annoyed because I had not given him time to clean. Instead, I arrived on a Tuesday afternoon and found the front door unlocked. I placed my suitcase inside and called Owen's name. He appeared at the top of the stairs. The moment he saw me, he moved backward. "Owen?" Both hands closed around the banister. I set the suitcase down and waited. He came downstairs one step at a time, never taking his eyes off my face. When he reached the bottom, I opened my arms. He stayed beyond my reach. "Hey, buddy." His eyes filled. "Dad said you might sound like Mom." At first, I thought the flight had made me misunderstand him. "What did you say?" "He said you might sound like her, but you're not really her." I lowered myself until we were at the same height. "Who does Dad think I am?" Owen shook his head. "I don't know." "Where is he?" "At Grandpa's." I extended one hand slowly. This time, Owen allowed me to touch his shoulder. His body was rigid beneath his sweatshirt. Did something happen while I was gone? His attention moved toward the black smart speaker on the living room shelf. Its blue light was glowing. Dad said not to talk when it's listening. I unplugged it. Then we sat together on the bottom stair. "Tell me what you mean about my voice." Owen wiped his nose on his sleeve. "Dad played things." "What things?" "You being mad." "At whom?" His chin trembled. "Me." I had been impatient with Owen before. I had raised my voice when he ran toward a parking lot, left the bathtub overflowing, or painted a wall with blue toothpaste. But he had never been afraid to come near me. Did Dad say where the recordings came from? He said you called. I did not ask Owen to repeat the words. A child should not have to perform frightening memories so an adult can gather facts. I made him a grilled cheese sandwich, turned on a cartoon, and called Daniel from the garage. He answered on the fourth ring. You're home? Yes. You said Friday. The assignment ended early. Silence gathered on the other end. Well, that's good. He did not sound pleasantly surprised. He sounded like someone had opened a door he thought was locked. Why is Owen afraid of my voice? Daniel exhaled. Rachel, can we not do this over the phone? I need to know what happened. He heard something he shouldn't have. What? Messages. What messages? Voicemails you left. I didn't leave threatening messages about our son. I didn't say threatening. He thinks I'm not his mother. Daniel's voice softened into the reasonable tone he used with angry parents at school. You explained fake voices to him before you left. He became confused. I had explained voice imitation to Owen after he overheard Daniel and me discussing a scam. That did not explain the fear in his face. Play me the recordings. Not now. Why? I'm driving. There was no engine, road noise, or turn signal. Where are you? At Dad's. You just said you were driving. I'm leaving Dad's. Bring the recordings home. Daniel stopped answering for several seconds. When he spoke again, his tone had changed. You sound agitated. Not angry. Not worried. Agitated. It sounded like a word selected for a report. I lowered my voice. I came home and found our son afraid to speak to me. I want to hear what he heard. I'll be there in 20 minutes. He arrived 43 minutes later. Leonard came with him. They entered carrying nearly identical expressions of concern. Leonard hugged me first. You look exhausted. I've been traveling. Daniel says the assignment was stressful. It was work. Leonard's attention moved toward Owen, who had edged closer to me. We all want what's best for him. No one had suggested otherwise. Daniel placed his phone on the kitchen table. Before I play this, I need you to promise you'll stay calm. Just play it. My voice filled the kitchen. Owen, I am tired of asking you to listen. If you embarrass me in front of your teacher again, there are going to be consequences. Owen stared at his plate. I had heard my recorded voice hundreds of times. The voice was mine, but the sentence felt assembled. The first half sounded distant, like a video call. The final word was suddenly clear and close. Where did that come from? You left it on my voicemail, Daniel said. When? 2 weeks ago. I didn't. You don't remember? Leonard lowered himself into a chair. Lack of sleep can affect memory, Rachel. I kept my attention on the phone. Send me the original file. Daniel picked it up. I don't think that's a good idea right now. Why? Because you're becoming defensive. They had not come to answer my questions. They had come to observe my reaction. Daniel knew I would challenge details. He knew I would become quieter when I was angry. He knew that if he pushed hard enough, I might finally raise my voice. So I gave him nothing. We can talk tomorrow, he said. After you've rested. That night, after he fell asleep, I checked my call history. There was no outgoing call to Daniel at the time the voicemail had supposedly been left. The following morning, Owen's school counselor called and asked whether I had been taking my medication. I stepped into the garage before answering. What medication? The counselor hesitated. Mrs. Mercer, I was told you recently changed a prescription. Who told you that? Your husband. For what condition? I think we should discuss this in person. The drive to the school felt longer than it was. Daniel's truck was being repaired, so I dropped him at work first. He spent the entire ride talking about a student who had submitted a documentary project late. He sounded completely ordinary. That was one of the hardest things to accept. Betrayal did not change Daniel's face. He still complained about traffic, adjusted the air conditioner, and reminded me that we needed milk. The counselor showed me an email he had sent 3 days earlier. It said I was receiving treatment for anxiety, insomnia, and prescription dependency following an overseas assignment. It asked the school to contact Daniel if I arrived unexpectedly or attempted to remove Owen during an unstable period. An audio file was attached. My voice said, I doubled the pills and still couldn't sleep. Maybe I should take Owen somewhere nobody can find us. Did I send this? No. Your husband did. Did anyone call me to verify it? Her fingers tightened around the edge of the paper. Mr. Mercer is listed as Owen's primary contact. I'm listed too. Yes. But no one called me. We were concerned that contacting you might escalate the situation. The phrasing belonged to Daniel. His story worked because it did not require everyone else to be malicious. It only required them to be cautious. I asked the counselor to preserve the email and its attachment. Outside the school, I sat in my car without starting the engine. Children crossed the parking lot holding lunchboxes and jackets, surrounded by adults who still knew exactly where they belonged. For the first time, I understood that Daniel was not merely telling lies inside our home. He was placing them in records. The pharmacy confirmed what I already knew. 8 months earlier, I had received a short prescription for sleep medication after returning from another assignment. I used it for 9 days and stopped. There had been no recent refill, no doubled dose, and no second doctor. The lie was attached to something true. That was why it sounded believable. By the time I reached home, fear had settled into something colder. Daniel was in the kitchen slicing an apple for Owen. "You went to the school," he said. I had not told him. "Who called you?" He set the knife down harder than necessary. "I work there, Rachel. People talk. That isn't your school. Educators talk. They showed me your email." His face changed for the first time. Not guilt. Irritation. I was trying to protect him. "From medication I'm not taking? You took it before. For 9 days. You were barely sleeping. 8 months ago." Daniel shoved the cutting board away. "You always do this." "Do what?" "Turn everything into a technical argument until nobody remembers what it felt like living through it." Owen appeared at the kitchen doorway. Daniel saw him and immediately lowered his voice. "Go finish your homework, buddy." Owen disappeared. Daniel pressed both palms against the counter. "I stayed here," he said. "I handled the fevers, the school calls, the nightmares. You came home with medals and stories, and everyone acted like I was lucky just to stand beside you." The words came out too quickly to be rehearsed. For one moment, I saw the resentment beneath the plan. Then his expression closed again. "This isn't about North Carolina," I said. His hand struck the glass beside him. It tipped over and rolled across the counter without breaking. "You think everything is about that job. Did you accept it? I told you I handled it." "That isn't an answer." He snatched the glass and placed it upright. "You're tired. We should talk when you're thinking clearly." Within seconds, the concerned husband had returned. But I had seen what lived underneath him. The next afternoon, Leonard arrived carrying a casserole. He had never brought us a casserole in 11 years. He placed it inside the refrigerator, wiped an imaginary spot from the counter, and asked whether I had scheduled an appointment with a psychiatrist. Why would I? "Daniel is worried." "Have you personally heard me threaten Owen?" "No." "Have you spoken to any doctor treating me?" "No." "Then why are you discussing psychiatric care?" Leonard straightened the stack of mail beside the toaster. "You're trained to believe every problem can be controlled. Maybe this is one you can't manage alone. My refusing to admit something I didn't do is not a medical condition. No one said it was. You just suggested a psychiatrist. For support." He spoke gently enough that a stranger might have thought he was being kind. Then he added, "The pill recording is difficult to ignore." I had never told Leonard which recording the school had received. The kitchen seemed suddenly smaller. "How do you know about that one?" His fingers stopped on the envelope he was holding. "Daniel played it for me." "When?" "I don't remember." "You remember enough to call it the pill recording." Leonard set the envelope down. "You're trying to turn everyone against each other." "No. I'm asking how you know what's in a file you supposedly only cleaned afterward." The softness left his face. "Be careful, Rachel." "Is that advice?" "It's concern." He collected his coat and left the casserole in the refrigerator. The next morning, 2 county family services workers came to our door. Daniel had submitted a report claiming I was emotionally unstable and had threatened to disappear with Owen. He gave them the recordings, screenshots of text messages, and a statement describing my supposed dependence on medication. Daniel sat beside me on the couch while they interviewed us. He looked exhausted and embarrassed, as though he hated involving outsiders but had been forced to protect our child. One worker asked whether I had recently returned from overseas. "Yes." "Have you experienced difficulty sleeping?" "Jet lag." "Have you used prescription medication?" "Not recently." Daniel stared at the carpet. The worker noticed. "Mr. Mercer?" He released a slow breath. "She doesn't always remember." When I turned slightly, he flinched before I had moved toward him. It was subtle. It was effective. "What exactly don't I remember?" "The messages. I didn't send them." "You called me crying 3 times." "Then show them the call history." The worker interrupted. This isn't a courtroom. No, it's my home. The atmosphere shifted. I heard myself the way strangers might hear me. Controlled, precise, demanding evidence. At work, those qualities were useful. In that room, they made me seem cold. Daniel spoke gently. She does this when she feels cornered. He had built the accusation around my real behavior. The workers interviewed Owen privately. When they returned, one explained that he had heard recordings of me threatening him, but had not personally heard me say those things while I was physically present. Daniel's mouth tightened. They recommended that neither parent discuss the recordings with him. Daniel suggested Owen stay with Leonard. I refused. The workers proposed that I stay elsewhere for 2 nights while they completed their first interviews. They called the arrangement voluntary. It did not feel voluntary. I packed a small bag. Owen stood in the doorway while I left. He did not cry. He simply watched me walk away. Before I reached the hotel, Leonard called. "You did the right thing," he said. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. "How did you know I left?" "Daniel told me." "He called you already?" "He needs support too. My son watched me leave my own home." Sometimes a mother has to accept that her presence is making things harder. The sentence was so calm that it took me a moment to understand what he was asking me to accept. "Is that what you told Daniel?" "I'm not your enemy." "No. You're just always standing beside him when something happens." Leonard's breath shifted against the phone. Maybe because he's the one who stayed. Then the line went dead. At the hotel, I reviewed the messages Daniel had submitted. They appeared to come from my number. "I can't keep doing this. Maybe you and Owen would be better without me. Don't tell the Air Force. They'll take everything." The phrases sounded like me, because pieces of them were mine. I had written, "I can't keep doing this," during a computer outage. I had once told Daniel not to call my supervisor about a migraine, because I did not want unnecessary attention. Someone had gathered fragments of my life and used them to construct a different woman. The next morning, Colonel Avery Grant asked me to report to his office. He reviewed the family services notice and told me my access to certain restricted systems would be suspended temporarily. It was procedure, not punishment. That distinction did little to soften the blow. "We aren't making a finding," he said. "I understand. Did you create those recordings?" "No." "Do you know who did?" "My husband submitted them." That was not my question. I had no answer that could survive scrutiny. "No, sir. I don't know who created them." Colonel Grant closed the folder. "Then stop using all your energy to prove you're a good person. Find out where the files came from." By Friday, Daniel had filed for temporary primary custody. The court granted him temporary physical custody until an emergency hearing could be held. I was allowed supervised visits. The first took place in a family services office, filled with plastic toys and a wall clock that ticked louder than it should have. Owen sat across from me, turning a puzzle piece between his fingers. "Are you mad?" he asked. "No. Dad says you get mad when people don't believe you." "I'm sad that you're scared. Was it you? The voice?" He nodded. "It sounded like me." That's not what I asked. An adult had taught him that sentence. For the first time, I wondered whether fighting would only hurt him more. Maybe I should step back. Maybe I should leave the Air Force. Maybe a better mother would know how to solve this without making her child sit in a supervised room. Then Owen leaned across the table. "Dad says your voice isn't real," he whispered. "But sometimes his isn't either." I did not question him. The visit supervisor was listening, and I would not turn my son into an investigator. "You don't have to figure this out," I said. He pushed the puzzle piece into the wrong space. "I want to go home." "I know. Which home?" That question followed me into every room I entered afterward. Daniel began communicating through a parenting application. Owen ate breakfast. Owen attended school. Owen slept through the night. Each message sounded less like a father speaking to a mother, and more like a report proving stability. When I asked for a phone call, Daniel replied that hearing my voice appeared to trigger anxiety. My own voice had become the reason I could not speak to my child. Colonel Grant gave me the name of Camille Brooks, a former military spouse who now handled complicated family cases. "She won't tell you what you want to hear," he said. "That's your recommendation?" "It's the only kind worth giving." Camille's office sat above a bakery in downtown Newport News. The conference room smelled faintly of cinnamon. She listened to one recording twice. Then she asked, "Who has clean recordings of your voice?" "My husband." "Anyone else?" "My father-in-law. He edited bedtime stories for Owen. Where? At St. Matthew's Church. Who benefits if your career is interrupted? Daniel? How? He wants to move to North Carolina. Did he accept the job? He claims he turned it down. Camille placed a legal pad in front of me. Write down what you know. Leave out what you suspect. I listed the dates. My assignment. The first recording. The school email. The family services visit. The custody filing. Camille read the page once. The first voicemail was supposedly left while you were in Germany? Yes. Can you prove where you were? Yes. Can you prove you didn't call? I have carrier records. That proves the story about the voicemail is wrong. Now we need to know how wrong. She hired Dr. Priya Shah, a forensic audio examiner. Priya worked in a small studio filled with monitors and headphones. I brought her the disputed recordings, along with old family calls, bedtime stories, and voicemails. She listened without speaking. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Finally, she removed the headphones. Someone worked very hard to make this sound like you, she said. My throat tightened. Can you prove it? Not all at once. She played the recording about the pills, then an old voicemail I had left Daniel months earlier. The words were different. The background was not. The same low refrigerator hum ran beneath both. That was my room in Germany, I said. Priya replayed the sound. The threatening voicemail, supposedly recorded in Virginia, contained noise from the refrigerator beside my bed overseas. It was the first clear crack in Daniel's story. The next discovery came quickly. The files were not stored as voicemails on Daniel's phone. They had been imported and renamed to look like messages. The threatening text screenshots were false too. They had been created using a website Daniel once taught his students to use for film projects. Daniel called me the evening Camille requested access to his devices. His voice was already raised when I answered. Do you have any idea what you're doing? I'm preserving evidence. You're dragging my students and my school into a custody dispute. I didn't use school tools to create false messages. I didn't create them. Then the inspection will prove that. He went silent for half a second. Dad only cleaned the audio. The words came out too fast. I sat up on the edge of the bed. I didn't ask about your father. You keep accusing him. I haven't spoken to you about Leonard. Daniel began breathing harder. You've been circling him since you came home. Why would I do that unless there was something to find? His next words arrived almost as a shout. Because you need someone to blame for the fact that Owen feels safer with me. Then he ended the call. It was the first time Daniel had lost control without immediately correcting himself. The following supervised visit, Leonard appeared in the parking lot. He was not supposed to attend. He stood beside Daniel's truck, holding a small plastic microphone from a children's karaoke set. Owen ran toward it. Grandpa brought my practice microphone. Leonard handed it to him. What do you practice? I asked. Owen pressed the plastic button. Talking normal. Daniel reached for the toy too quickly. Dad, he doesn't need that here. Leonard's face tightened. It helps him separate real voices from pretend ones. The visit supervisor stepped closer. Who told him he needed to practice? Neither man answered. Daniel crouched and pulled the microphone from Owen's hand. You don't need this anymore, buddy. Owen's face fell. Leonard stared at his son. For a moment, the two men seemed less like partners and more like people blaming each other for a plan that had become harder to control. That evening, the supervisor documented everything she had seen. 2 days later, Priya called Camille and me back to her studio. She lowered the speech in one recording until only the background remained. 4 bells rang. A pause. 2 more. The 4th bell dragged slightly. St. Matthew's, I said. Priya turned in her chair. You recognize it. Leonard complained about that bell for months. The same bells appeared beneath every disputed recording. Daniel changed his explanation. He now claimed Leonard had only processed the files to improve their sound. But if the recordings had been altered, they could no longer honestly be described as untouched voicemails. Then the church computer supposedly failed. Leonard reported that a power outage had damaged the drive. St. Matthew's had experienced no power outage. That lie prompted the church board to remove him from the studio and preserve the computer. Before the technician completed the work, Leonard asked to meet me. He chose a diner near the church. When I arrived, he was already seated in a booth with a cup of coffee he had not touched. I'm asking you to consider what this fight is doing to Owen, he said. I left my coat on. You brought a recording device to his visit. It was a toy. He said he uses it to practice talking normally. Children misunderstand things. He seems to misunderstand a lot of things after spending time with you and Daniel. Leonard's mouth flattened. Daniel has been the stable parent for years. He has been the parent who stayed home more often. That matters. It does. It doesn't give him permission to invent threats. No one invented your absences. The waitress approached, sensed the tension, and walked away without asking for my order. Leonard lowered his voice. Let Daniel take the North Carolina position. Owen will have a house near the school, a yard, and a father who is home every night. And I will have what? You'll have your career. The answer came too easily. Is that what this was always about? This was about giving Owen one dependable home. He already had one. You were never there long enough to see how often he asked when you were coming back. The words hurt, because they contained truth. I had missed nights. I had missed school events. I had chosen assignments that mattered to me. But Leonard was using real pain to justify a manufactured crime. You didn't have to create evidence, I said. His face changed slightly. Not enough to be a confession. Enough to tell me I had chosen the correct word. I don't know what you think you found. I think you're afraid of what was left on that computer. Leonard stood and buttoned his coat. You always believed being calm made you right. No. I believe facts matter even when the calm person is wrong. He left without drinking his coffee. The church technician recovered part of the deleted project. We did not need every technical detail. The folder names told most of the story. Calm, tired, angry, crying, Rachel model. Then Camille opened another folder. Owen Court. Inside were recordings of my son crying. One came from the night our dog died. Another came from the hospital after he broke his wrist at 5. Daniel and Leonard had placed those real sounds beneath false conversations to make it appear that Owen was frightened of me. I had thought stealing my voice was the worst thing they could have done. They had also taken my son's grief and given it a false reason. The recovered files revealed something larger. Daniel had not merely considered the North Carolina job. He had accepted it. There was a draft announcement introducing him as the new director of digital media. Beside it was a photograph of Daniel and Owen standing beneath the school's entrance sign. The picture had been taken 2 months before I left for Germany. He had brought our son there without telling me. In emails to the school, Daniel described himself as a single parent separating from a wife suffering a serious psychological decline. The school had offered him a house on campus. He was expected to start in August. One message from Daniel to Leonard explained the sequence. The command review has to happen before the relocation hearing. If she keeps her clearance and full salary, they'll say she has stability here. We need the school report and 1 medication clip before May. Leonard had replied, I can improve the pill section, but the boy's reaction still sounds disconnected. Daniel answered, use the hospital crying. He was younger, but nobody can tell. They had not created the recordings because they feared I was dangerous. They created them because Daniel needed events to happen in a specific order. First, the school would become suspicious. Then family services. Then my command. Then the court. If I lost access at work, Daniel could claim my career was unstable. If the medication story was accepted, he could demand supervised contact. If he received temporary custody, he would become Owen's established primary parent. Then he could ask to move for a job he had already accepted. Custody was not the final goal. It was the bridge Daniel needed to leave Virginia with our son. At my next visit, Owen and I built a tower from plastic blocks. Halfway through, he said, Grandpa says we might live by a lake. I placed a red block on top. Did he? In the new house. What new house? His face tightened. I'm not supposed to tell. It's a surprise. You're not in trouble. Dad says you'll come when you're better. Every part of me wanted to tell him I was not sick. Instead, I said, adults are still deciding where everyone will live. Do I get to pick? No. But you get to tell the truth about how you feel. Owen pushed the tower over. What if Dad says the truth sounds wrong? Then you still tell it. The following morning, Daniel formally requested permission to relocate. That night, he appeared outside my temporary lodging. He stood beneath the parking lot light with both hands buried in his coat pockets. You shouldn't be here, I said. I need 5 minutes. Use the application. Rachel, please. The word sounded unfamiliar in his voice. I stayed several feet from him. Daniel glanced toward the windows of the building. You can stop this. How? Tell the court you support the move. And let you take Owen to another state? You can visit whenever you want. Whenever my assignment schedule allows. His face tightened. You chose that life. We chose it together. No. I adapted to it. For the first time, he looked less like a strategist and more like a man who had spent years measuring his life against mine and deciding he had lost. I was always the one waiting, he said. Waiting for calls, waiting for orders, waiting to see whether you'd miss another birthday. You could have asked for a divorce and become the weekend father while everyone praised your sacrifice? So you fabricated evidence. I was trying to make the court see what our life was actually like. No. You made the court hear a life that never happened. Daniel took one step closer. If you force this into a hearing, they'll play everything. I know. They'll hear you threatening Owen. They'll hear how you built it. His expression hardened. You think one expert is going to erase 11 years of me raising him. No. But 11 years of parenting will not erase what you did either. Daniel's eyes shone beneath the parking lot light. For a moment, I thought he might cry. Instead, he said, Dad said you'd never compromise. There it was. Even then, Leonard's voice was inside his decisions. Daniel walked away without saying goodbye. The hearing took place the following Monday. Daniel arrived early with Leonard. Through the glass doors, I watched Leonard adjust his son's tie. Daniel pulled away before he finished. The gesture was small, but it told me something had broken between them too. Camille handed me a bottle of water. You don't need to look confident, she said. I don't? You only need to listen and answer accurately. That I can do. The custody evaluator had recommended that Owen remain temporarily with Daniel. Her report did not call me abusive. It said the recordings created unresolved safety concerns, and that Owen appeared anxious around me. It also noted that Daniel had handled much of Owen's daily routine during my assignments. That part was true. Daniel had packed lunches. He had attended school meetings. He had been there when I was not. His later choices did not erase the father he had once been. That made the case harder. Daniel's attorney played the recordings first. The school threat. The medication confession. The statement about disappearing with Owen. Daniel testified that he had become concerned months earlier. During cross-examination, Camille asked, "Why didn't you call emergency services?" I was trying to protect Rachel's career. By sending the recordings to her commander? That happened after things escalated. When did they escalate? When she returned from Germany. The first file was created before she returned. Daniel adjusted one cuff. I meant the situation escalated. Camille did not argue. You testified that these were voicemails received on your phone. Yes. Did you edit them? I cleaned them up. With your father? He has better equipment. Did you add words? No. Did you add your son crying? Daniel's attention moved toward me. No. Why are none of the files stored in your voicemail history? They may have been deleted. But the audio remained? I don't know how the phone stores everything. You teach digital media. I don't teach phone forensics. Camille showed that the text screenshots had been created using the same fictional message website Daniel used in class. He denied making them. His voice remained controlled, but he began rubbing his thumb across the side of his wedding ring. The custody evaluator then admitted that she had not known the recordings were edited when she wrote her report. If the recordings were fabricated, Camille asked, would your recommendation remain the same? No. Priya took the stand next. She did not explain every technical step. She played what mattered. The same background hum beneath an old Germany voicemail and a supposed Virginia message. The repeated church bells. The absence of any original voicemail record on Daniel's phone. Then Camille called Leonard. He approached the witness stand slowly, leaning harder on his cane than usual. She asked whether he had edited the files. Yes. Did you know they would be used in a custody case? Eventually. What does eventually mean? Daniel was concerned for Owen. Did you know the files would be presented as real voicemails? Leonard's attention shifted toward the judge. Yes. Camille displayed the recovered folder names. Calm, tired, angry, crying. Why were Rachel's recordings separated by emotion? For production purposes. What production? A family archive. Then, she showed his email. I can improve the pill section, but the boy's reaction still sounds disconnected. What did the pill section mean? I don't remember. What did the boy's reaction mean? I don't remember. The courtroom monitor displayed the recovered project. My voice. Generated sentences. Owen crying beneath them. Leonard's account had created the file. His entry card placed him inside the studio at the time it was made. Daniel had been attending Owen's school science night. Leonard had been alone. His gaze traveled toward the courtroom exit, then toward his son. Daniel kept his eyes on the table. "Why did you assemble the recording?" Camille asked. Leonard gripped the edge of the witness stand. "I believed Owen needed stability. Had Rachel threatened him? She was always leaving. Had she threatened him? She put her career first. That was not my question." His voice dropped. "I believed she eventually would." The answer settled over the courtroom. Leonard had created evidence of something that never happened because he believed it might happen one day. Camille placed the relocation email in front of him. "You knew Daniel had accepted the North Carolina position?" "Yes." "You knew he needed custody before requesting relocation?" "I knew he wanted a fresh start." "You knew these recordings could trigger a review of Rachel's military duties?" Leonard stopped answering. After consulting his attorney, he returned and admitted that the command review was part of the plan. Daniel leaned toward him. "You said you only fixed the files." Leonard's face turned toward his son. "I was trying to help you." "You said they wouldn't find anything." The words left Daniel before his attorney could stop him. The courtroom became still. Daniel shut his eyes briefly. His lawyer placed one hand on his arm. Camille did not react. She simply asked to play the final file. It was a deleted voice memo recovered from Daniel's automatic phone backup. His voice came first. "The command won't act unless the medication part sounds current." Leonard replied, "I can build it from the Germany calls." Then Daniel said, "Make Owen quieter underneath. If he cries too hard, it sounds staged." The recording ended after 19 seconds. Daniel did not confess everything. He did not need to. Those 19 seconds connected the voice model, the medication lie, Owen's crying, my command review, and the relocation plan. Daniel's attorney stopped writing. The custody evaluator turned back through her report. Leonard stared at his hands. Daniel pulled off his wedding ring, held it in his palm, and then closed his fingers around it. I did not feel triumphant. I felt tired. The voice in the recordings belonged to me. The choices behind it belonged entirely to them. The judge did not issue a final custody ruling that morning. She returned Owen to my physical custody, while ordering a full evaluation. Daniel received supervised visitation. He was prohibited from removing Owen from Virginia or discussing the litigation with him. The court ordered the remaining devices preserved and referred the fabricated evidence for further investigation. Outside the courtroom, Daniel tried to approach me. Camille stepped between us. "Use the parenting application." Daniel stared past her. "Rachel, I never wanted it to go this far." For a moment, I saw the man who had made pancakes on Sunday mornings and driven 40 minutes to retrieve a stuffed bear. Then I remembered him choosing the sound of our son crying after a broken wrist because he thought it would seem convincing. "How far did you want it to go?" His fingers opened. The wedding ring sat in his palm. "I wanted one thing that was mine. Owen was never something you owned." Daniel lowered his hand. Behind him, Leonard stood alone near the courtroom doors. Neither man moved toward the other. Owen was brought to Camille's office that afternoon. He entered, carrying his backpack and the plastic dinosaur he had owned since preschool. For several seconds, we simply stood there. Then he ran into my arms. "Are you coming home too?" "Yes." "To our house?" "Yes." "Is Dad coming?" "Not tonight." On the drive home, Owen watched the buildings pass outside the window. At a red light, he said, "I knew the bad voice wasn't all you." "How?" "It never breathed right." I glanced toward the rearview mirror. He shrugged. "You breathe before you say my name." Children notice the parts of us adults assume are too small to matter. The Air Force review remained open for another 6 weeks. My access was restored after the digital evidence and medical records were examined. Colonel Grant informed me that the administrative concern had been resolved. He did not apologize for following procedure. I did not ask him to. Before I left, he said, "Do you need time?" "Yes, sir." "How much?" "I don't know yet." It was the first time in years I admitted uncertainty without feeling weak. Daniel lost the North Carolina position after the school learned about the false statements in his application. His Virginia school later terminated him following its own review of his use of school equipment and instructional tools. Months later, he entered an agreement resolving allegations involving falsified digital evidence and misuse of my identity. He received probation, community service, and restrictions on his use of certain digital systems. Family court did not erase him from Owen's life. His visits remained supervised at first. Later, they expanded after counseling and compliance with the court's orders. Some people believed he deserved to lose all contact permanently. Part of me agreed. But custody was supposed to protect Owen, not deliver the most emotionally satisfying punishment for me. Leonard resigned from every position at St. Matthew's. The church acknowledged that its equipment had been used without authorization. He was prohibited from contacting Owen outside approved visits and required to cooperate with the investigation. Several months later, Leonard sent me a 6-page letter. Most of it described his fear that Owen would feel abandoned, as Daniel had after losing his mother at 12. Near the end, he wrote one sentence that came closer to the truth than anything else. I thought preventing a future harm justified creating evidence of one. I did not respond. A year after the hearing, our house sounded different. For months, I unplugged every smart speaker and covered the camera on my laptop. Owen stopped using the plastic karaoke microphone Leonard had given him. He placed it in the back of his closet, beneath a stack of board games. I considered throwing it away. Then I realized that would allow Daniel and Leonard to decide what an ordinary object meant in our home, so I left it where it was. Owen began seeing a child therapist who never asked him to decide which parent was good and which was bad. She helped him understand that a recording could be false, while the fear it caused was real. He had been frightened. He had been confused. None of it had been his fault. I accepted a training position at Langley that reduced my travel for a while. Before everything happened, I might have viewed that decision as surrendering part of my career. Afterward, it felt like choosing where I wanted to be. Daniel and I divorced. The process was quieter than the custody hearing, because the most important truths were already documented. We communicated through the parenting application. We attended separate school events whenever possible. We learned how to exchange a backpack in a parking lot, without creating another battlefield. I did not forgive Daniel. I also stopped needing him to understand what he had done before I could continue living. Those were two different things. One Saturday afternoon, Owen found the toy microphone in his closet. He carried it into the kitchen while I was making grilled cheese sandwiches. "Can we use this again? For karaoke?" He shook his head. "I want to record a story." I turned down the stove. "What story?" "The bear one. The bear who joined the Air Force?" "He didn't join. He visited." "I remember it differently. You told it wrong." "That sounds possible." We sat at the kitchen table with the microphone between us. There was no editing software, no clean version, no corrected pauses. Owen forgot part of the story and started again. A truck passed outside. I laughed in the middle of a sentence. The refrigerator clicked on behind us. We left all of it in. When we finished, Owen replayed the recording. My voice sounded tired. His sounded older. Neither sounded perfect. He listened until the end. "Mom? Yeah? How do I know which voice is your real voice?" I thought about the question before answering. "The real one won't ask you to be afraid," I said. "And it won't need you to lie." He nodded, then pressed the record button again. That evening, our voices filled the kitchen exactly as they were. And for the first time in a long time, neither of us was afraid to listen. If someone has ever twisted your words until you stopped trusting your own memory, share your story when you are ready. Sometimes the truth does not arrive louder than the lie. It simply leaves behind something the lie cannot explain.